here today on City Pier in New London, January 22nd, 2021. Today, the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons goes into force, as they say, goes into effect. And we're here today because we want to begin this process in this day by remembering the first people who came to oppose the building of the submarines here in New London, Connecticut. So the Committee for Nonviolent Action started in the late 1950s as an organization to really focus on the buildup of nuclear weapons. And they came to southeastern Connecticut, according to their own information, to quote-unquote educate Americans to the realities and dangers of the nuclear deterrent policy typified by the Polaris submarines and their deadly cargoes of nuclear missiles. And those submarines were made across the river, as all of the strategic nuclear weapons have been made, the submarines. They call their campaign Polaris Action. And on June 1st, they moved into 13 North Bank Street, which I believe is where the garage is right now. There is no more North Bank Street over there. But that's where they wanted to establish themselves, right here in this area, in this community. There was an article in The Day about them appearing. So The Day partially says, the Committee for Nonviolent Action, CNVA, began the first phase of a 3-month protest against Polaris missile-firing submarines today with establishment of a headquarters at 13 North Bank Street. As an alternative to massive retaliation, the peace groups propose the U.S. disarm unilaterally, if necessary, and thus win some... I'm going to stop. I feel like I'm competing with the... I'll go back to reading this. I'm competing with the train station woman. I'll be right.
Yep, a little bit. Yep, and that'll give you a chance to do what I should have done before anyway. So.
Okay, I'll go back to the beginning of the quote. Okay, I think she's done. You done?
Are you done?
I'm going to start with the
Yep.
quote. As an alternative to massive retaliation, the peace group proposes the U.S. disarm unilaterally if necessary, and thus win support of hundreds of millions of people throughout the world. Such a gesture, the CNVA maintains, would raise immense psychological barriers against war and would weaken the rationale for aggression. A walk from New York City began on June 10th and arrived here on June 17th in New London, along with the sloop Satyagraha, which came right up here. Satyagraha had what we now know as the peace symbol. CNVA claimed what then was called the nuclear disarmament symbol, which was created by the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament in England only a couple of years earlier and brought to this country by Bayard Rustin, who was both the founder of the Committee for Nonviolent Action and also most known as the strategist who organized the 1963 March on Washington. So at many, many times there were launches of small boats in this area over decades of people trying to get to electric boat. To prepare for those kinds of summer actions, they organized a 16-day training that took place right there in their office. Those who organized it and the resource people that came were people who had been exploring the power of nonviolent action basically since the late 1930s. They were the first people who really began to talk about about what Gandhi was doing in India. And that included Richard Gregg, who wrote The Power of Nonviolence in 1939, Wally Nelson, who was the first nonviolence trainer for Congress of Racial Equality, his wife Juanita Nelson, who was arrested for sitting in at a lunch counter in D.C. when she was a Howard University student, Dave Dellinger, who was then at Liberation Magazine, and Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, who was a black minister from Alabama who had been active very early on in the civil rights movement. Barbara Deming came and got off the train right here. She came up to write an article for The Nation magazine about Polaris Action and about the training. She came planning to spend a day. What she said in an article that she wrote was, I've been reading Gandhi eagerly for the past year, but I expected to be unimpressed by the people I would find in New London. I assumed blandly that if they were in fact impressive, I would have heard about them before this. But she stayed for the whole 16 days and it changed her life. She became one of the most important writers on nonviolence, and particularly on nonviolence and feminism, and as a result being part of this community. At the end of the summer, CNBA made two decisions. One was they used to go over to the hygienic restaurant, and in there they made the decision that they would listen. They had been listening for 3 months to the workers at Electric Boat saying, go tell it to the Russians. You want to disarm, go tell it to the Russians. And they decided to go tell it to the Russians. It was at that day at the hygienic in August that they decided they would walk from San Francisco to Moscow with that message of disarmament. The other decision that they made was that they would stay here in southeastern Connecticut and continue their opposition to the Polaris submarine, continue Polaris action. And within a few years, they bought the farm in Voluntown, thanks to Barbara Deming and her partner, Mary Miggs, which is still there.
Good afternoon. So I'm Ann Scheibner. I grew up in southeastern Connecticut in Stonington and commuted to New London for 6 years to go to high school. And after I graduated from college, I came back to help start a drop-in learning center. And in 1971, found myself going to a training at the Voluntown Peace Trust for what turned out to be the last Polaris action, because they were about to finish manufacturing that series of submarines and begin on the Trident. So Marge Swan at that time was in residence at the Voluntown Peace Trust. For those of you who get a chance to go up there, it was a drop ceiling in those days. You couldn't see the American cedar beams, you couldn't see the colonial fireplace, but thanks to Chuck Mathai, you now can. But the training is what I remember, and particularly because my high school classmates' fathers worked at EB in management, basically. I talked to Cal Robertson this morning. It turns out that both his parents worked at Electric Boat. It really was the employer for this part of the world. And what I particularly appreciated about Marge Swan and her training was the respect that she felt that we owed to the people who worked at EB by dressing appropriately. And so I wore my best blue suit and jacket and my grandmother's pearls, which I wore again today in honor of the occasion. And so it's 50 years ago. Hard to imagine that. But in the CNBA publications, they wrote about it. About 30 persons participated on the days of protest. Many thousands of leaflets were handed to workers and guests. Workers posted them on bulletin boards inside the plant. Many of the workers had seen us before. Many were new, many were veterans of war, including now the Vietnam War. They were attentive. They were seldom hostile. They were troubled, it seemed, by the job that they were trapped in. What can we do, was the question. What do you say to a worker whose family is fed and clothed and housed by military spending? Convert the plant to peacetime use, to fabricate houses, schools, hospitals, to build ships to transport food to starving people, we said. But what do I do in the meantime? General Dynamics should pay you with the profits that they have made from war while they tool up for peace. Pay you not to make things of destruction. Pay you not to make submarines, like the government pays the farmers. This is 50 years ago, really, yeah? $4 billion not to grow food. But these subs said the workers, are providing us with protection, they said. Only until the first bomb drops, we answered. And so it went. The discomfort of the guests was obvious. They very often chose not to accept our leaflet that outlined the extent of General Dynamics' involvement in the arms race. Don't remind us, they said in their glances. We came to a party with a band and banners and flowery speeches. A celebration over the carcass of death to come, unless nations of people can lay aside these grotesque instruments and persistently settle their differences rationally and with compassion for the children of other lands, with as much compassion as we display for our own. Were it only so that we start with Vietnam, the protest grows. Perhaps President Nixon, or other president, and his government will respond. Our frustration and sense of doubt is increased by the recently released articles about the secret and deviousness with which the government prepared for and fought a war under the guise of helping a determined people to establish democracy. What a lie. What a tragedy. What disservice to those in the service of their country. What disservice to the worker, the builder of the weapons, and more. What of the receivers of these instruments? What deception is being practiced today that we may discover years hence, or maybe never find out? It's all connected. Electric boat submarines, the war in Vietnam, the hunger for food and justice and peace. CNVA hopes that one day right will prevail. And here we are in this sanitized industrial workspace. I was trying to think of a mural that would do justice to the melting flesh of people in Hiroshima. Because the images that I grew up with were of vacant shells of buildings. The idea that people suffered in the dropping of those weapons was totally not in the history books. We have to find a way to help our young people understand what's at stake, and hopefully their children will not have to be here 50 years from now. Thank you.
But submarine, as we know, submarine production continued. The Polaris became the first submarine with nuclear weapons on it. And then the replacement for that became the Trident submarine. The keel laying of the first Trident submarine was in April of 1976. And Liz McAllister, who was right here holding the sign, was one of the 8 people who went to the keel laying of that and attempted to pour blood and was arrested for that. So Liz really gets credit for being both the first group of people to protest Trident, and then as part of the Kings Bay Plowshares, the last group to protest Trident decades and decades later. So over those years, there were several organizations. After the keel laying, Rick and myself moved up here with a community of folks who moved into the Community for Nonviolent Action in Voluntown, and we organized the Trident Conversion Campaign, which then later became the Stop Trident Commission, and demonstrated at launches and commissionings. And Rick's going to talk about that.
My name is Rick Gaumer, and I've lived in southeastern Connecticut since 1976. Just after that keel of that first Trident was laid. It is kind of amazing that somehow, as the Polaris submarines were aging, that during the Nixon and Ford presidencies, they decided that they would create a weapon that was thousands of times worse than the Polaris submarine. And yet that's what they did. They designed a system that, if ever used, just one out of the 24 submarines would have ended all life on Earth. And they built 24 of them, so I don't know what other planets they were thinking they would destroy, but this one was doomed if any of those were ever used. So we determined that this weapon system should never be built. It was an atrocity, and we would demonstrate, and we would organize demonstrations. So when the Ohio had was launched in 1979, we had 4,000 protesters join us in front of Electric Boat. Now, partly that was because this was also when the anti-nuclear power movement was growing. The Seabrook demonstrations had happened. And we did our best to kind of meld those two so that people would understand the dangers of all types of radiation, not just if a nuclear weapon was used, but also from nuclear power plants. And we continued that work. And at every launch and significant event in the Trident being built, we always had anywhere from 3,000 to 1,000 people joining us in front of the boat for launches and for the commissionings. When the boat would actually be out at sea and be used. And some of these demonstrations got really interesting. There was a submarine that was supposed to be the USS Rhode Island, but they renamed it after the senator who really, really made it possible for the Tridents to happen, and that was Senator Henry Jackson. And so we had a vigil at the commissioning, and also a protest at the launch. And for some reason, the Young Republicans for Peace Through Strength and the Ku Klux Klan showed up at both of those events. Only 6 to 8 Klansmen, but quite a few of the Young Republicans. But for us, it made it obvious that the waste of resources that were going into these machines were starving the communities of color in the United States and the poor, and so having the Young Republicans and the Klan there supporting the building of these things made it pretty plain what side one should be on. They originally said they were going to build 24 Trident submarines. The Soviet Union collapsed late 80s, early 90s. So did the support for building Tridents. So they stopped at 18. 18 Tridents. Well, they were plenty. I mean, they were 17 more than needed to destroy the Earth, but they finished them. And then as the 90s rolled along, and as they started working on disarming, on lowering the nuclear threshold, I mean, even to this day, we have got nuclear weapons out there that are just a trigger away from being launched, and it's really incredible. But the Tridents have been cut back now. They made the 18, and then with treaties with the Russians, they had to retire 4 of them. They turned them into fast attack submarines, and with the remaining 14, they had to fill 4 of their 24 missile silos with cement so that they could only have 20 missiles. oh well. But now the Tridents have been active since 1979, and one by one they'll be being retired after 44 years of service. By 2042, all the Tridents will have been retired, unless we retire them sooner, which I think could be a great idea. So they've designed this program to build 12 new nuclear weapon submarines, ballistic missile submarines called the Columbia class. And they're hoping to get that rolling in the next year or two. And they're building a brand new building at the south end of Electric Boat because they need a bigger dry dock to build this new class of submarine. It's as deadly as the Tridents were, actually maybe even more deadly, depending on how much work they do on creating the smaller nuclear warheads that they'd like to have. At this point, I forget how much we're spending per year, but it's trillions of dollars to make our nuclear arsenal even more dangerous than it is now. All of this is such a waste, and hopefully it will be stopped.
Hey folks, we're here today at the bottom of the Thames River, just in front of the Electric Boat Shipyard, where the Trident submarines and fast attack submarines have been built, and where the Navy is gearing up to build the next level of nuclear submarines, the Columbia. And we are here to celebrate the nuclear treaty that is going to be effective as of today. It will make nuclear weapons illegal, and we hope that the 50 signatories and all the other folks signing on to the nuclear ban will join us in celebrating this historic day. Up the river is the U.S. Navy submarine base. Behind us is Electric Boat Shipyard, and the Naval Underwater Systems Center was here on the left. That's where the engineering department of Electric Boat is right now. This particular area has been gifted with a number of plowshares actions over the years. I think there have been 3 or 4 in this area. My participation in the Thames River Plowshares in 1989 was just down the river here. We jumped in the river and swam up to the submarine, and some other folks took a canoe and paddled down, and we were able to hammer and mark the submarine as the death machine it is. And we witnessed in court, and we are part of the Solidarity Plowshares movement with folks from Kings Bay that are serving prison sentences right now for their part in disarmament actions. I'd like to just read the banner that we're holding. I know for myself, one of the great horrors of the arms race is the theft from people that need food and resources and medicine and education and shelter. The United States plans to spend $100,000 per minute over the next 10 years on nuclear weapons. And that's why we're here today, to stand with the treaty and to stand against the arms race. Thank you.
All right, I just want to wrap up a little bit more by saying that as the construction of the Trident went down, the workforce was built up with the Seawolf contracts, the Seawolf class of submarines. But yet what happened at that point, after they built one, was that the Berlin Wall came down, was that the Soviet Union collapsed. And so George Bush Sr. needed to make a major cut in weapons production, and made a major cut by cutting the entire Seawolf class here. We're a democratic state, easy for him to do. However, what that meant was that there were massive layoffs, and Electric Boat began the layoffs the second the announcement was made. This is an opportunity for those of us who had been organizing for economic, for organizing for economic conversion in this community for decades, since Bob Swan began to do that in the early 1960s. to really organize. And so we brought together in the early 1990s, we brought together folks from Electric Boat, workers, people in the community. We did listening project surveys where we went out and asked people, what their thoughts were about what could be done. And here, right here on this pier, on May 13th, 1996, a group of us, representing the unions, representing business, representing politicians, revealed an action plan for jobs. So here on the pier was Congressman Sam Gadenson, Representative Wade Heislop, EB union leaders Ken Dela Cruz, Mel Olson, and me representing the Community Coalition for Economic Conversion. And we all agreed that public resources needed to be targeted to projects that would create good jobs, green jobs, and we suggested steps for moving forward on that. Some progress was made. We did affect some of the retraining that was done for the workers. But, as soon as there's any talk of any more money coming to the Pentagon, those kinds of plans go away. Another example of that was in 2014, the state decided, again, because the workforce was going down at Electric Boat, that they wanted to have a report on Connecticut's future, strategies to bolster Connecticut's economy. It was instructed by legislation to focus on manufacturing, defense diversification, and green technologies in the workforce development. While the committee explored all these things, a local group here thought this was a great opportunity to again talk about what it would mean for this community to have real economic conversion, and got very involved in doing this and invited the committee to come to New London. At the last minute, that was yanked. They brought it over. They brought the program over to the other side of the river. They had one of the top managers at Electric Boat talk about this new submarine that would replace Trident. They had someone from the Workforce Development Board talk about the importance of getting into the middle schools and teaching STEM to the kids so they'd be workers at Electric Boat. And now we have the Columbia class, which they have just been building up. So every time there's any effort to really look at what else could be done here, it's taken up by corporate profits. It's taken up by the idea of this money. So the aims that were first stated by CNVA, an alternative to massive retaliation, Peace Group proposes that the U.S. disarm unilaterally, if necessary, and thus win support of hundreds of millions of people throughout the world. So I think today we celebrate the hundreds of millions of people throughout the world in the 51 countries and in the other countries who are moving for this treaty, who have really done what folks intended to do at the beginning. But I think we need to give credit to the grassroots groups who have been doing this work since the late 1950s to continue to raise this issue and this opposition to these horrendous nuclear weapons.